it. Welcome everybody. This is the year ahead in global crime and corruption. We have here with us Paul Radu and Drew Sullivan. They're the co-founders of OCCRP. I'm Julia Wallace. I'm the deputy editor-in-chief, and I'm gonna basically be moderating a discussion with Paul and Drew. We're really happy to see all of you here for what's our second annual webinar now. We did it last year, kind of because of COVID really, but it turned out to be way cooler than we had thought. We got to talk to some of our readers. We got really good questions. And I think one of the takeaways last year was that the questions are so good that we need to leave a little more time for them. So we're gonna wrap it up a little earlier. In case you weren't here and you don't know how it works, you guys who are in the audience, your microphones are muted, but there's a Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom screen. So if at any point during this conversation you have a question, just type it in there. We'll try to get to it. I'll read them out for Paul and Drew. And don't worry, they're only seen by the three of us, so you don't have to ask it to this entire webinar. So let's get started. We have Drew here from the United States. We have me joining from Italy. We have Paul. I don't know where Paul is. Paul joining from an undisclosed location.
Somewhere in South America, let's say.
Somewhere in South America. So, you know, that's a huge change in how we organize ourselves that we've had over the past couple of years. I know that probably most of you in the audience have also been experiencing this change. What about in organized crime? How have you guys seen organized criminals kind of changing what they do over the last year or two? Could be about COVID, but also just kind of general trends that you guys are seeing. Are organized criminals talking to each other on Zoom in their bathroom, or, you know, what's going on?
Paul, you want to take that first?
Sure. Hi all, and thank you, Julia. Well, I believe last year by this time, we addressed a little bit the fact that organized crime are usually early adopters of technology, of really advanced technology, and we've kind of pinpointed to the fact that with COVID, with more people moving online, criminals are going to focus, you know, on the online world a bit more, and I think this is exactly what happened. We've seen an increase in ransomware, for instance. We've seen an increased adoption of cryptocurrencies by criminals who are trying to bypass the banking systems to cash in from ransomware and to launder money from many of their other crimes. I think what happened quite a bit in the past year is that criminals integrated technology a bit more with their businesses. So we see more of this opportunistic type of criminality, where you have ransomware packages, malware packages that are offered in the dark nets, that are embraced by criminals of all types, and then they find common ground and they work together to advance their criminal interests. Now, this favored much, you know, the well-established criminal networks, the Italian mafias, the Mexican groups, you know, the Eastern European, you know, syndicates, but it also created or grown a kind of a new breed of criminals, and these are the ad hoc type of criminals, people who are, you know, who enter this world of crime because the barrier is so low right now. They just enter a darknet space, a market where, you know, malware, for instance, is bought and sold. They buy the package and they use it for their own purposes. And they might become part of this, you know, criminal networks, but sometimes this is just what I call, you know, a little bit more of a democratization of crime. This is just going to grow as we go on. And I think the other trend that we've seen, especially with the well-established organizations, with organizations that have decades on their back, decades of criminal activity, is that they've embraced even more the techniques that usually are used by the secret services at state level. They've embraced more, you know, surveillance techniques, and they've again took advantage of what's out there, of commercial surveillance software and other types of softwares. But first of all, they took advantage of the fact that many people who are online and many organizations, many companies, even media, are not prepared in terms of security, are not really ready to face these criminals who are at it 24/7 And I think that's an important thing that we'll discuss right now, how we are preparing for that, and how we all should be a little bit more, should be a bit readier to confront this reality, because it's just going to grow as we go.
Yeah, and I think Paul's exactly right. And I think taking it from kind of a larger perspective, I mean, I think if you look at the history of kind of governance in the world, we started with kings, and, they pretty much, government was the only thing that ran things. And then as we developed democracy, you had things like media come in as big players, and industry become a big player, and they influence government. And I think now organized crime is another player in the world, and you especially see it in Russia and other places like that, where it's an integral part of how governments work. They rely on organized crime as part of the ecosphere that they use. So if you need somebody killed, if you need something hacked, it becomes almost kind of a participant in the government process, the ruling process of all of us. It's now intricately tied, and we saw this with propaganda. We saw this with election interference. We saw this, where many of these tools of criminality were adopted and used by governments. And I think that's teaching organized crime so that they're much more audacious and they're much more sophisticated, so that they are now interfering in, the government process on their own. And you see it in places like Serbia, where, ministers, of state are organized crime figures. And I think you're going to see that in a lot of other places, where it's really this criminality is a major societal force that needs to be considered in the governance of people. And I think we've been screaming about this for 10 years, that this is coming down the pipe and is already happening. And it's been largely, I think, ignored. But I think there's been greater recognition now. And, the Summit for Democracy, I think, is a good example of government saying, we're going to put the foot down, we're going to invest in this, we're going to invest in civil society, in media and other places. Media at the same time has been shrinking in its importance. It's been labeled, as fake news, and, mainstream media has basically been undercut very effectively to the advantage of, people who don't want accountability in government. And so consequently, that's worked very effectively. Government has always underfunded law enforcement and prevented it from really getting into the sophisticated work. There's very few people who are really working on organized crime, even to this day. And so consequently, there's not a lot of pushback against organized crime on the global level. And I think we're seeing where that influence has meant that they are much more powerful. But I do think that there is a recognition by governments. I mean, there's been a lot of papers and analysis that have been done by academia and by think tanks that basically say organized crime is a national security problem. It's not terrorism, it's organized crime. That's a national security problem. And that's finally a recognition, I think, that's valuable. And the pushback is coming, and we saw it in the summit, and we see it in other places. We're invited to go many places and talk about these issues, with the EU and, those types of organizations. What do we do now that this is a national security issue? And I think that's going to continue to grow, and there's going to be pushback against organized crime. That's the good news for this year.
Okay, I was about to say this is getting extremely depressing really fast. So what can we do given how terrible, this kind of sounds right now? I'm especially wondering about the media. What kinds of tech tools or other kinds of tools can journalists use to fight back against the adoption of these kind of intense surveillance and other tools by organized crime groups and governments? Is there any hope? And I think, riffing on something you said, Drew, is the media, is there any hope for it to be a powerful force, to be as influential as organized crime in some of these countries? Or, do we basically, are we going to have to align ourselves with governments and hope that they will kind of come up with some kind of policy to make things right? Or is there anything that we can actually do as journalists to kind of fight back against this kind of stuff ourselves?
Yeah, so why don't I take this first, Paul? So there, we are in a monumental time of change, and the media its traditional function and form, which is really kind of an offshoot of industry, it really needs to be re-examined. And I think that we need to remake a new space, not so much in the halls of power, covering it from the halls of power, but being more embedded with the public. And I think that's where we call it the journalism commons, the area where the public works with the media, using technology to more effectively respond immediately to things that they don't want, and working with civil society as well. We have what we call the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, which is a program that we work with Transparency International. And that's really an attempt to say, wait a second, we now need to become people who elevate the voice of the people more effectively. So we got to live with the people and effectively give their voices to power, because voting, as we know, is not always the most effective way anymore. Voting is almost irrelevant in many countries in the developing world. So the power needs to come from the people, and we need to serve the people, not the halls of power. And so I think that's the change that comes around in journalism, and that means technology. That means developing systems that can talk many to many. So I can find some member of the public who's got access to information that might be willing to blow a whistle on some problems that are going on, and somebody who's got good information can reach the right journalist who can act on that information. And that means developing bots and other things that can manage that relationship, because if you try talking to the public, it's very difficult. I get 30 emails a day, and to address all of those is very difficult, and people don't always communicate clearly. I'm not sure it takes a lot of back and forth, and that really needs to be, unfortunately, automated somewhat. There also needs to be tools where the public and journalists can get better access to information. We have the Aleph database, which is a knowledge management system. It's an open source knowledge management system that we built and we're extending, which allows us to take all this data, crunch it, and figure out, who's who, so we can map money and power, so we can look at the relationships. Money and power doesn't change that much. And so it's really important that we understand it and be able to use it as context for all that we're writing about. So there are a lot of tools that need to be developed. Tools are expensive. It takes millions of dollars to develop a good piece of software. We have to do it over time with smaller amounts of money and really, really smart people, who are committed to the work that we're doing. That's how we end up doing it. But, it takes time. And overall, the whole news industry, it's lost its financial backing. It needs to get, reestablish, through the public and through institutional and even government donors, that kind of ability to do their job, to the degree it needs to. We don't even mess with, stories that are, that would be a huge story in a country. We don't have time. We've got too many stories that we're working, and we don't have the skills of all our reporters to the stage that they can do all the stories that we want to do. And so consequently, it takes a tremendous amount of resources and time to do this. But, we're getting better, we're getting more efficient, and governments are recognizing. And, the Biden administration pledged $224 million, to developing some of these key things that are necessary. And so that's good news. It just needs to be followed up, and it needs to be implemented.
And if I may, just to add on this, a few words. I think Drew is right. I mean, this is a time of great change, and I'm always saying, we're kind of late, when it comes to embracing technology and follow the money processes, compared to the criminals who've been at it for far longer than we did. But this is just not good enough anymore, And I mean, when you talk about security, we do need to up our security. The more successful we become with our reporting, the more exposed we are. People are going to target us more. Criminals are going to target us more, and they have at their disposal a huge arsenal, a huge package, from legal action against us, court cases, to surveillance software, to killing us. So, but we also need to up our newsroom type of security for people to trust us more with their information. We do need the public to be a participant, as Drew said, in all of this. Without the public, we're nothing. Now, what we're trying to do is to serve the public, but to serve the public, you need to be on par with what the criminals are doing. So I mentioned before, criminals are early adopters of technologies like blockchain and cryptocurrencies and things like this. Now we do need to adapt our follow the money processes to that. We need to be able to follow the crypto, and this is exactly what we're trying to do. It's baby steps. Unfortunately, we'd like it to be a lot faster, but as Drew mentioned, this requires huge amounts of money. But we've hired our first cybercrime editor this year, and she's doing amazing work. We're able to track down transactions across blockchains, and this is changing how investigative reporting is done, and we're trying to inspire other newsrooms to embrace the same methods, because we know that we're very proud of our work, but there needs to be more journalists out there doing this type of work. So I believe there's a lot of change potential there, and I believe we're serving the public in a much better way than we were, for instance, 5 years ago, but we do need to do a lot more.
So moving backwards a little bit to something that Drew mentioned, one of the biggest pieces of news in the anti-corruption space in the last few months has been something that happened just last week at the Summit for Democracy. Anti-corruption was a huge topic, and the US government announced its new, and I think its first ever anti-corruption policy, which was a pretty big deal. I've heard a lot of takes on this. Some are very cynical, and some are really excited, including some real experts on corruption are saying that some of the kind of policies that are being put forward in this plan are what they've been asking for years. Where do you guys come down on this? Do you think it's actually going to change anything? Is OCCRP going to be put out of business?
No, in fact, one of the announcements in there was that the U.S. government has asked the other 110 democracies to fund the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, the project we've been working with, Transparency International. We've been doing this for about 3 years, and the way it works is we do investigative reporting, and then we pass that information over the wall to activists who can then get a quick start. We help them understand, what we found, and we share what information that can be shared with them, and they can think about it, and they can develop an approach and an activism policy in many of these stories, or they can file GLOMAG filings or suspicious wealth orders, or even sue people. And what we found is we had an assessment done, and we found that this was 5 times more impactful than if we had just published our story alone. And so what happens is as we increasingly we're getting these regional networks, these global collaborations on stories. A big project comes out like Pandora, or some of the projects we've done where we have cooperated with a large number of people. Everybody gets slammed with valuable news information all at the same time, and then activists are ready with specific policy recommendations and specific actions to punish these people. And it's making it easier for law enforcement to kind of follow up on these things. And that's really critical, because to fight corruption, you need the exposure through journalism, you need the activism to get government to do something, you need law enforcement to do something about it, and you need new policy to really put in place. All 4 of those have to work together. We're trying to get those 4 columns, those pillars of anti-corruption to really work more effectively. So that, there's been a call for $10 million in funding to expand that beyond OCCRP and the media and beyond TI and the activism group. So that was very good. They've also put in money that we hope to work with them on for, some global defense for journalists in the lawsuit area. So, and a lot of the other things in there have the potential to be really good. Of course, you never know how it's implemented, and you never know if things are done right. But, it's the first major commitment I've seen to this kind of basket of issues that fight corruption, things like UBO laws and other things. And it can only be heartening. I mean, yes, it may not go as far as some people want it to go, but it's a first step, and it's a big first step.
If I may, I believe these policies that are going to be put in place are really going to make a dent into the high-level corruption and organized crime especially because financial transactions are targeted and real estate, and this is where lots of these criminals and kleptocrats are parking their money. What I think needs a little bit more attention as well, besides the banking system and all these financial kind of issues, is the logistics industries. I'm talking about shipping. I'm talking about the physical way that criminals move their their things. Those are very, very important, because if you talk about drug trafficking, you got a whole containers industry that's complicit into all of this. You have ships, you have planes, you have all sorts of you have trains, you have trucking companies and all this. And this is also something that needs to be addressed. I mean, there needs to be a better system of checks and balances there too. Lots of times the ownership of these big logistical companies is not really vetted. And this is where, unfortunately, criminals are inserting their people, and where they bribe a lot of people, not to talk about ports and terminals in ports and places like those. Those need to be focal points right now for policy as well, because otherwise, if you address just the financial part of the criminal deal, you won't be that successful.
And the criminal services industry, which the enablers who basically work out these very sophisticated systems, they have to be better watched over, and when they are, they always can say, oh, well, we didn't know they were criminals. Well, we shouldn't be able to say that anymore.
Drew, can you explain what you mean by the criminal services industry, just for people who might not know?
Yeah, that's our snide definition of the banks, the law firms, the registration agents, the hedge funds, the others who basically make a significant amount of their income from servicing the needs of criminals around the world and corrupt dictators and autocrats. So they, their argument is, oh, well, we don't know who's necessarily using our services. Our services are open for all. But there's clear evidence that they are designing systems specifically to bypass, revealing ownership and to launder money and do all these things. And I think they need to be actually charged with, criminal complicity for the work that they're doing. Mossack Fonseca is the one we all know, but they were one of literally thousands of companies. There are about 10 law firms in London that I wish we could put out of business. Organizations like Shillings and Shillings, which goes out and basically helps organized crime people attack the media, knowing who they're representing and knowing what they're doing. I mean, I think that's basically complicit criminal behavior. So if anybody knows somebody at Shillings and Shillings, you can tell them I said that.
They might be on this call.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move to the reader questions, the audience questions. But before that, just like 2 quick hits, one for both of you from me. So over to Paul. Paul, if OCCRP had all of a sudden infinite money and resources, what would you have us do immediately? What kind of project?
I would go for a worldwide project that would look at property in the sense, not just fancy real estate in London, but really big land surfaces, agricultural land, lakes, forests, everything. I would mobilize, like an array of satellites to take images from the orbit. I would match that against databases worldwide to find out the BOs of those particular places, because unfortunately, I think that's going to show us that organized crime is owning a lot of the earth beneath our feet. And that's the kind of project that we need to tackle, to show exactly what is their power. Their power, is the fact that they managed to insert themselves, into our lands for decades, and we need to uproot them.
Okay, if anyone out there wants to fund that, get in touch. And Drew, what is a story, an investigative story that you've read the last year in 2021 that we didn't publish, but that you really wish we had?
Well, just because we didn't publish it doesn't mean we won't. You mean from another news organization?
Yeah.
Oh man, there's so much good work that's been done. Can I think about that and get back to you before the end of the?
Okay, but you have to answer.
Do you have one that you have, Julia? You read a lot of these. What's one that you thought was particularly good?
Oh, you're not allowed to ask the moderator. Okay, I'll think about it and get back to you. You think about it and get back to us. And we will move over to reader and audience questions, I should say. Okay, so here's a good one. Is organized crime really actually a national security issue in every country? And if not, what countries have actually been successful in combating organized crime, and how did they do it?
That's a great question. Paul, you think of the examples as I try to answer this one, but it's not been successful in every country. There are countries that don't have the tradition of organized crime, that have maybe more cohesive societies, or have dealt with it in a different way, and crime is not as significant an issue as it may have in the past. But even in those countries, as organized crime gets globalized, then people come in and start to take advantage of things. So whereas something may have been an acceptable smuggling or poaching issue in one country with an indigenous group that used a certain resource, suddenly they're given a lot of money to go in and exploit that resource, and it becomes what wasn't a problem, what was kind of imbalance, becomes a problem. So I think the danger is that there are many more areas opening in many more countries where organized crime is a problem. The problem with organized crime is it comes in and it builds an infrastructure, and it basically replaces aspects of government. It provides security, it gives jobs, it gives healthcare, all at a cost to the people. And whenever the government is weak in providing those things, that's areas where organized crime, even if it's not locally called organized crime, tends to do really well. So, but I think in some countries it's very clearly, and I think if you look at all of Eastern Europe and parts of Eurasia, that those are, and Latin America, and especially Central America, those are places where organized crime is clearly out of control, and is causing instability in government. They're putting people who they're comfortable with, autocratic leaders. Organized crime is an autocracy in and of itself. There's one leader, and everybody else is subservient to that leader, and that's what that's the kind of government that they push. They push plutocracy. They push lack of democracy, and so these are forces to kind of they stop accountability. They don't want to be charged with anything. So these are the forces that are pushing. When the current leadership of Serbia took over, they fired all the longtime organized crime experts and all the prosecutors, and they got rid of all the judges, who had been, conducive to fighting organized crime. So they just eliminated anybody who could actually fight organized crime, and then as you get organized crime, you have instability in the country, and you have, attacks against neighbors, are more likely. Putin has attacked every single neighbor he practically has, except for China, at some point, to deflect people from his unpopularity with the public. To bring out the patriotism, and then he put organized crime people in the little places that he's taken over, and now he's going to do it to Republika Srpska, and that's the problem. Is it creates instability, and that's a national security problem as well, and they undermine governments all over the place. It's been a tradition, of autocratic governments, but they use organized crime to undermine other neighboring countries, all the time, and so consequently, it is an issue, and it needs to be addressed on the local and on the global scale. And there's nobody really to address it on the global scale. That's except for investigative reporters. We're the only natural enemy of organized crime on the global scale.
Yeah, I think transnational organized crime created this transnational criminal fabric that kind of spreads all across continents. And I don't think there's any particular country that deals with organized crime in a meaningful way, particularly because national law enforcement is always national, it's confined to borders. Besides that, in many cases, and we've seen this for many years, for decades, sometimes organized crime is part not just of it's part of the country strategy. we're seeing in Belarus how Lukashenko used organized crime methods and channels to bring migrants to the borders with the EU. These are criminals using organized crime, criminals who happen to be in politics and who are using organized crime to, reach their goals. And there's always this intersection between the state and organized crime at some level, especially in parts like South America and Eastern Europe. But the other countries are not sheltered either, because the more we reveal, the more we expose how organized crime works, the more you see the inner fabric of governments, even in democracies that are very well established, who are actually protecting organized crime, protecting them in many, many ways. People get impunity, by getting the citizenship of a country and so on. So this is something that will have to be addressed at some point across the board, across continents, because this is, organized crime are becoming more and more, even violent in their ways. And these politicians who are now in their pockets are not safe at all, in their current positions. They're serving criminals, and that at some point they will pay for it, not just with justice, that's going to come their way, but the criminals themselves. That's not a harmonious world that they're building with these politicians. This is a world of victims, and criminals are victims themselves in the end, and they eat each other.
And the ultimate country as an example of where organized crime has achieved a lot of power is Mexico. And Mexico is basically ungovernable in large parts of the country. People are getting, their properties taken away from them. I mean, there's just wholesale impunity of criminal behavior going on in Mexico, and the government can't really do anything about it. And as you study organized crime, you realize it's far worse. It hides itself very effectively. So you may drive through the Italian countryside and you say, wow, this is beautiful, and there doesn't seem to be any violence or organized crime there. But everybody who lives there now is affiliated with organized crime, because it's what they have to do in order to survive. And that's what's happening in a lot of countries. And that's the hidden, stuff that goes on behind the scenes with organized crime. It's far more problematic than people realize.
Okay, I think you guys have actually answered like 6 questions in the course of that answer. Here, though, is another question that I think is really insightful and actually stems right from what you were just saying, Drew. The public in very corrupt countries often cares most, if not exclusively, about instances of petty everyday corruption. So how can we get the public more interested and kind of aware of large-scale, bigger picture issues of global corruption?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think that's true. I mean, how crime intersects, and corruption interacts with you is the cop who wants the extra bribe, or the person who says, that you can't get your house fixed unless you pay extra money, or you can't get in to see a doctor unless you pay a bribe here. That's what the public sees because it's the money out of pocket. What they don't see is the added costs and all the, problems of inefficient government caused by, having criminals, basically taxing everything, by sucking up money, by, tenders going out to the wrong people who do a poor job for too much money, and all these things. That's the hidden cost of organized crime the public is not seeing. And I think part of it is, for journalists, to do a better job. We're pretty rare. OCCRP, we've got some of the only, organized crime reporters in many countries. We probably are, a big percentage of the global, reporting on this topic. There needs to be far more journalists working on this issue because people don't really understand and don't undersee this. And, to get to the larger issues of how it affects things regionally, is again just a matter of being able to explain the story and explain what's really happening. The problem is people don't see what's really happening. They're caught up in misinformation. They're caught up with, distractions from what's really happening. And, we as journalists have to do a better job of explaining and telling these stories.
And I think it's also about the public and journalists and activists sometimes dealing and explaining crimes in silos. Some people are focused on the trafficking in persons, some are focused on the drug trafficking, some are focused on other issues. But we do need to do a better job at explaining how these are all integrated. The human smuggling goes hand in hand with many other crimes. Criminals don't just take one line of business and run with it. They have multiple lines at the same time. So it's the difference between prosecuting a crime inside a big volume of crime or addressing the whole volume of crime and understanding the whole criminal organization. And this is one of the problems, one of the big problems with law enforcement, that go after certain crimes and ignore the bigger picture. This is where a transnational law enforcement organization would come in to be able to go for far wider than that, and to stop criminals in their tracks. Because otherwise, if we address single type of crimes, we ignore a huge array of other crimes, and we're not efficient at all as journalists or as law enforcement or activists.
So you want a global RICO statute, Paul? Is that what you want? Yeah. There you go.
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely.
Okay, so we have.
Huh? Did we answer that question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
We have a few questions on UBO laws, actually. So let's move over to that. Somebody is wondering, and UBO is ultimate beneficial owner, in case everyone doesn't know that. So somebody asks, can you speak more about UBO laws? Are they really that important in law enforcement to tackle corruption? And do you think governments are beginning to take corporate secrecy and UBOs more seriously?
So UBO laws are really been a lot of focus on that in the last couple of years. There's been, the European laws is being promulgated and around the Europe, and yeah, it is. It's been a focus, kind of the simple low hanging fruit in terms of things to do, although it's extremely difficult to implement it. But the answer is yes, it's critical, because ultimately, most asset classes, we don't know who owns it. On bank accounts, we have due diligence, know your customer, everything like that. They have pretty strict laws. But in hedge funds and in companies and other things, we've done a very poor job. Paul was talking about real estate earlier. That's true. We don't, real estate is not, well documented. And so consequently, UBO laws allow you to basically know who is ultimately behind a particular asset class, in this case companies, which often own real estate and other things as well. So it's extremely important. The problem is that the laws are not getting implemented evenly, that they're still using proxies to own the properties. It's still going to an offshore company in some cases. So the offshore isn't known who knows it. They say the ultimate beneficial owner, but you don't know ultimately who owns that. So it all really depends on the local implementation of the law and how effective they are. And really, you need to have the same kind of, know your customer type laws as banks have that really require you to get down there. But if you do get all the way down to the bottom, you still find a Cyprus lawyer, and you still find a granny in, some rural country, who knows nothing, that they don't know that they own that asset, So it's a very hard thing to implement, and it's a very hard thing to enforce.
And actually, I'll just jump in and say that if anyone is interested in reading about the actual effects of what happens when you institute UBO laws, you might be interested in our project on Luxembourg earlier this year. Luxembourg implemented a UBO register as part of EU-wide laws that make all the countries start this up, basically. And I think, the project shows what's good and what's bad about this in concept and implementation. On one hand, we got all this information, which is good. We learned quite a bit from the UBO information that they put out there. On the other hand, the register is very hard to use. There aren't really a lot of regulations about how searchable these things need to be. And in some cases, they're not open to the public. I think the US is going to have one, and it's not going to be open to the public, which is a great leap forward and also a huge disappointment to us as journalists. And in the Luxembourg case, we did an analysis, and we found that quite a few of the declared beneficial owners didn't match the same declared owners of the same companies in other jurisdictions, or they were children or babies. So, you know, it's a real mixed bag, but you can read different perspectives, I think, in that project. Okay, next question. Drew, you mentioned collaborating with civil society organizations who coordinate advocacy to reach a wider audience. Do you have any examples of collaboration with other actors that allow you to reach a wider audience and instigate change?
Other actors, you mean besides civil society organizations?
I think this questioner means civil society or anyone else.
Right. So I mean, there's a lot of examples. You know, through the years, you know, investigative reporting is naturally impactful because, you know, somebody grabs the information and runs with it. So we've always had kind of impact, you know, thankfully, because other people have taken this information and run with it, whether it's been a political party or a civil society organization or law enforcement themselves. Karen Greenaway, who used to run the FBI's a kleptocracy branch, said that 50% of her cases in the kleptocracy branch came from investigative reporting, you know, that basically, you know, outlined, you know, some assets or things that they didn't know about. And so it really is kind of a critical part of the whole process. And so, you know, in our examples, you know, the great example we always have is the Azerbaijani laundromat, where, you know, we published about this large money laundering financial fraud vehicle that was started with a bank in Lithuania and one in Latvia, and that was used to launder money. And we were able to show that money from Azerbaijan went in to bribe people at the European Commission, or the members of Parliament of the Council of Europe, I should say. And so, you know, they did great work, TI in that particular case, but other organizations as well, kind of highlighting this and showing how this worked. And they were able to really quickly address a number of these issues. Many of these people were sanctioned fairly quickly, and you know, actions happen. And that's really, you know, the mechanism we want, whether it's civil society organizations, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's public interest lawsuits. You know, all of these are kind of tools that can be used to balance it. And we literally have dozens and dozens of examples of where this works. And that's why we want to really expand the GAC.
And if I may add something to this, I believe a place where we can also help and inspire people is in the cybersecurity group. The more we advance, the more we explain how criminals work online, the better prepared the people who are in the cybersecurity space are. So I think, you know, this is very, very important to kind of highlight how organized crime is very active, you know, in this area too, and to be able to have a discussion, an open discussion with cybersecurity experts, you know, for both parties to be really, really prepared, because this is all in the public interest, and we're seeing more and more forays by organized crime into that world.
Okay, so this question kind of segues from that a little bit. Did you, OCCRP, or people in our network, did we face any threats or attacks as a result of our work on the Pegasus spyware project? And other than general increased digital security, how can journalists mitigate the risks of surveillance?
It's a very, very hard question. And yeah, indeed, I mean, our own Khadija Ismailova from Azerbaijan has been targeted with Pegasus by her country, and she's been targeted in many, many ways. She's been thrown to jail. She's been, you know, under a lot of duress. And there's other attacks that happened that we can't talk about, but we see an increase in surveillance, an increase in politicians, corrupt politicians and criminals using cyber surveillance against OCCRP reporters and other networks reporters. How we can guard about that is, again, this cooperation with the cybersecurity community. We do have a very strong tech department at OCCRP that's handling our security. We have a constant dialogue with them. They're building tools for us. They're embracing some of the tools that are out there. We always need to keep ourselves in the loop regarding threats, and we always assess who is the enemy. And the enemy is always different with every investigation. So that is a huge challenge to adapt to that type of threat that's always that's ever changing. But this is what we're working with, and we're trying. We know that we're not that we'll never be able to be 100% proof against criminals, because criminals have lots of resources. But we do our best, and I think this far we've been to some extent successful in the sense that we were able to put out our reporting. We were able to work in a safe environment when it comes to data that we received from the public. And that's, I think, most important, to be able to serve the public and to work with the public.
Yeah, and just some numbers on it. 10 of the people ultimately in OCCRP were, were monitored by Pegasus. And Pegasus is one, it's 2%, 4% of the industry. There are countries like UAE and others that have 5 times more people that they're monitoring than Pegasus was. And so, and that's just the country level. There's probably 10 countries with the capacity, probably about 20 companies that do this kind of work. So it's, there's far more monitoring than I think we realize is going on. And journalists are really good to monitor because a lot of information comes into them and then goes out. So, and far more information comes in than actually goes out. Probably we publish about 10% of what we know. And that's why we're just this easy, it's a great place to kind of get that. But what showed in the Pegasus project is that really governments are antagonistic towards information, and they're antagonistic towards, and believe me, I mean, there's some US governments that I have no question they would monitor everybody at the Washington Post and New York Times if they had the ability to do so, or they thought they could get away with it. So this is a really serious problem that requires punishing those who are caught. And I don't think, that was adequately done with the Pegasus project. So, I mean, I think government should be, face far more serious, scrutiny when they get caught doing this. And just assume, we just assume all our phones are tapped. I mean, that's basically, this thing is listening to us, hi UAE, how are you doing? It's happening all the time, and we just have to accept that.
Yeah, I'm sure they're interested in this discussion.
They should be.
Yeah, and just another thing about Pegasus and this kind of surveillance, it's something that like journalists feel very strongly about, because this kind of surveillance really impedes our ability to do our jobs. It makes people not want to talk to us. It makes people scared of us. Like it has a kind of chilling effect that goes beyond just the fact that you yourself are being watched. But like not to be super too optimistic, but one thing that we can do is actually write about it, and we have been doing that, and we're like super committed to that. And the Pegasus project has actually, I think, had a pretty big impact, and NSO Group, it doesn't seem like it's doing great. They announced yesterday, I think, that they're going to wind down their Pegasus unit and get rid of it. So, that's a good outcome. We've shamed them. They are not respectable right now, and that's good for us.
Yeah, we are kind of the gloomy boys. I have to admit it, that our information is never happy, but knowing that it prepares you.
Yeah, but I believe we also need to have like a global discussion about the internet at some point, and about the structures, and the code that's inbuilt with all the services that we're actually using. I mean, from Apple Messages to whatever, Google Meets or whatever other services, Zoom even. I mean, a lot of the code that's the base of these services is legacy code. It's code that was built, was created years and years ago, when there wasn't much concern about security. And it's full of holes. I mean, and we're seeing these holes exploited by criminals every day in the wild. And then we're hearing about zero-day exploits and about markets where all these zero-day exploits are sold and bought and things like this. So I think we really need to have a discussion about that, and to acknowledge that what we've built this far is not very sustainable, and it's something that's prone to attacks.
Yeah, and American companies, the way they do it is they, and actually not just American companies, all companies, they basically have a certain amount of risk tolerance, and they say, okay, they're going to exploit. We're not going to it'll cost us this much money to fix this code, or we can just worry about, after it gets hacked to pay off the costs of, getting hacked. Well, Apple didn't really pay out a lot from their software getting hacked. They had just about every single freaking service on an iPhone was compromised, by NSO, and Apple has not paid a price for it, and they should pay billions of dollars out to the people whose lives they ruined because their systems, they didn't bother to go and fix the systems that they should have fixed, that they let spaghetti code, live on in their phones, and that's just there should be a class action lawsuit against Apple, for their gross incompetence in allowing this to happen. That was kind of radical. Sorry about that.
Speaking of corporations, we have a really good question about big companies. Somebody is wondering how they play into organized crime and corruption, and do they have a role in fighting organized crime or not?
I'll take the first shot at it if you don't mind, Drew. So we've seen in the past years, banks being used heavily by organized crime, and they acknowledge that, and at some point in time, and they're trying to up their game. And in the meantime, cryptocurrencies popped up, and they're embraced a lot by criminals. So the banks are kind of late at what they're doing. But it's better to act now than never. Now, the reality of this is that many big corporations are used by organized crime. Many subsidiaries of big corporations we're seeing as being set up with organized crime people, with or without the knowledge of the center of those companies, the headquarters of those companies. So I believe there needs to be a reckoning at the level of big transnational corporations. I was mentioning the logistic industry earlier, that there needs to be a reckoning at that level where corporations check their supply chains a little bit more, check their services a little bit more, pay a lot more attention to how the creative branches of organized crime is using them. So I think, unfortunately, that's something that, Drew was mentioning, that this risk, the criminality risk, is kind of inherent with big corporations, and they accept it, and they don't quite ever pay for the damage they're doing by allowing their services to be used and their infrastructure to be used by criminality.
A lot of times it's a symbiotic relationship. The Italian fashion industry, they know that their fashions are being, basically reproduced by organized crime and sold, but they're okay with that. They don't try to stop it. They want their product out at a lower price point because it leads to, people thinking it's a popular product, and more people buy their very high-end one, which is a very high markup. So, there's these weird symbiotic relationships around the world between organized crime and companies. And it's because, as I said at the beginning, organized crime is its own force in society now. And you as a company, or even as an individual, have to deal with it in some countries, and you have to make some kind of compromise because it's not being really rooted out by law enforcement in a lot of places. So, if you're, if you think you're staying at the Four Seasons Hotel, and you're in a comfortable Western hotel, it's probably owned by organized crime if it's in, many countries, so they have to produce a product, they have to have a hotel in a particular place for their global strategy, and that's going to be owned by the people with money, which is often people with close, oligarchs or close connections to an autocrat or organized crime. And people tolerate that, and they have tolerated it for many decades. And until you make kind of significant progress, you can't fight all these situations. You have to kind of make it, one step at a time.
All right, so we have time for one more question, and it's from our Washington office. They would like to know from you guys, what is ahead in 2022 for OCCRP?
Wow, there's a lot of stuff. So first things, we're going to have a brand new website in 2022. It should come out in January. I think you'll find it faster. I think you'll find it, we actually went back and we found missing stories that had been disconnected over the years. And so we've cleaned up some things, and we can move much more quickly. You'll start to see our reinvention of investigative reporting next year. We're starting to work really hard at re-envisioning and reimagining what investigative reporting should be. And I think you'll see that in greater interactivity and greater use of kind of graphics to do things. We've just opened our offices in Sydney to cover the Pacific region. So you're going to see more Pacific stories. We have a reporter now in Vanuatu and another in Fiji. And so, you're going to start to see that get, there's a lot of kind of cryptocurrency and scams that are based out of the Pacific. So hopefully we can start covering some of those issues more effectively than we have. And of course, China is a big player in that region, so we can explain better what's going on with China. So that's going to be happening next year. I think you're going to see, we are going to make a giant push inside OCCRP to secure our reporters. We've spent a lot of time and effort, but we've finally have what we think is the resources we need to get into the nitty-gritty of locking down reporters more effectively. Something as simple as buying a reporter in Kyrgyzstan a new phone, is critical to securing them, because we can't secure old phones where the operating system isn't, updated anymore. So we've got some money to do that. We're going to be making a big push in improving security. We hope to get more connections with the people. We've been fairly static this year because we've been, sequestered like many of you have due to COVID. We hope as we get traveling again that we can get more partners and more organizations working together. We've got a few big projects we're working on that are going to be big kind of Pandora type, Panama paper things. You'll see those in the new year. We're excited about some of those projects going out. Paul, you got some others you want to mention?
Yeah, I probably should mention that our engineers with Aleph are gonna improve our tools. Aleph is gonna become a lot better in terms of the ease of use by the public. There's going to be a new data ingestion system with Aleph. And also, as I mentioned before, we're adapting our tools to the new reality, to the new follow the money techniques, to following crypto. So Aleph is going to be able to identify wallets inside data sets. And I think overall, with the opening of new OCCRP offices around the world, we'll be able to do a lot more of this transcontinental type of reporting that, in our opinion, is very, very important, because it shows, again, the global fabric of organized crime and what helps corrupt politicians thrive and do damage in their countries.
Julia, anything that we missed?
I don't think so. That's pretty comprehensive. So Drew, I haven't forgotten about your question. I'm circling back to ask, what's your favorite investigation of the year that we didn't do?
Oh man, Paul, can you think of something? My battery is running low on my computer, so if I dodge out here quickly, it's not me avoiding the question. It's
yeah, I think.
All right, well, I'll say mine, Julia, if you want. Yeah,
Julia, please.
This reporter for the New York Times, Ian Urbina, has done some really, really amazing work over the years. He does a series called The Outlaw Ocean, where he kind of writes about like human rights abuses on the high seas and the general like jurisdictional lacuna that occurs there. And he's just done an amazing story in the New Yorker like a week or two ago about secret prisons in Libya that are kind of keeping migrants out of the EU, and just the general thuggery that the EU is outsourcing to Libyans. And it's absolutely worth a read. And I would really love it if OCCRP could find a way to do more stuff about what exactly is happening on the oceans. So that's mine. Any last words or ideas?
I think also the work that's been done about golden passports by The Guardian, by Daphne Foundation was actually amazing. We've had some contribution to that. but that's something that we need to focus on more. Also, I think some of the work done in Africa, I'm really envious about, the project out of DRC that involved the Sentry and other, media organizations. That was really, really a good project where, again, this infrastructure, criminal infrastructure in the banking sector, was exposed to a great extent, and that's amazing work. So I think more and more organizations are doing work that piece the puzzle together, and we're trying to help too. We're involved in many of these investigations, where we don't quite advertise ourselves or our people, but there's a lot more that's done outside of OCCRP, and it's amazing. And we're learning from those as well.
Okay, so Paul got you off the hook, Drew, and we're out of time. So we're gonna have to wrap this up until next year. I think we'll definitely be doing it again in 2022. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We hope that you're following us on Twitter and Facebook. And anything else, Drew?
Yeah, thank you for being accomplices. We can't do this without you. You guys have been incredibly important. We had a record year this year in accomplice registration. So, we deeply appreciate it. And, let us know what you'd like to know. And we're going to have more seminars, webinars next year, and tell us what you want to hear about. And we'd be happy to talk about it.
Yeah, we have an engagement editor. He's called Charlie Turner. If you want to reach out with any feedback or requests, you can get in touch. The email is membership@OCCRP. So yeah, thank you very much for your support and for being part of the network.
Have a happy holidays and see you next year.
Thank you all. Happy holidays.